Hi everybody and welcome back to our discussion on Chapter 18 in Strength and Conditioning concerning plyometric training. So what is important to know about plyometric training is that essentially we're trying to work with the elastic energy that our musculotendinous units can store for us. So we know that our muscles and our tendons have proprioceptors in them, Golgi tendon organs, and muscle spindles that respond to stretch. So when I pull against these, it's going to create a stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex, when used appropriately, allows me to store energy in my musculotendinous units and then turn around and utilize this energy in a concentric contraction immediately afterwards. So when I utilize this stretch reflex, it allows me to kind of use this built-up energy and have a stronger contraction than what would be available through just a normal concentric contraction. Right? And the way this works is we have our eccentric loading phase. So this is when you go through this stretch reflex and all the energy is going to be stored in that musculotendinous unit. And then you have this period where you transition from this eccentric loading to this concentric unloading or a concentric contraction. This transition between the eccentric loading and the concentric contraction is called the amortization phase. So during this phase, you have to go through a transition where the energy is going from one place to be utilized in the next. Ideally, plyometric training is going to help you shorten this amortization phase. So as soon as it is stored, I can turn around and use it. So the shorter your amortization phase, typically the more powerful your concentric contraction will be. So a good example of this is if you have ever seen anybody go through triple jump or long jump. When they land right before they go into their jump, all of that loading and all of the sprint energy goes down into that penultimate step and then is transitioned into the travel through the air. All right, that is a great example of plyometric training. Right? So whenever you're going to do plyometric training with an athlete, you need to go through a needs analysis for their sport and that particular athlete. So we have different considerations when somebody is a beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So when you go through here, if you have a beginning athlete, I have to consider points of contact. So how many impacts is this athlete going to be able to sustain before I start to get into diminishing returns? So beginning athletes cannot have as many contacts as a more advanced athlete. So typically beginning athletes are as little as 80 contacts. So if you're doing something like bounding or skipping, that could be done in 2 trials. If you're working with a more advanced athlete, they can handle larger loads. Then I have to also consider the speed of the contraction. How quickly do I need this athlete to move in this particular sport? So things like long jump and triple jump, I need them to have a very quick amortization phase. Something like a shot putter, they're incredibly explosive, but they have more time to load and move through that particular range of motion. So pay attention to the speed of contractions. Also, requiring athletes to contract faster than their body is prepared for tends to lead to muscle strains, tears, and other bad injuries. So pay attention to the speed of contraction that not only is required, but what an athlete's body can handle. Next, you need to pay attention to the height of your jumps. So somebody that is younger, more towards adolescent, and somebody that is older, like a master's athlete, you don't want them to be jumping from big heights. That is because their bodies, one, as they're younger, is going through development and is not going to be as prepared for those type of jumps. Pay attention to protecting the joints and other musculature. And then when somebody is older, like your master's athletes, they can't handle as much of that shock absorption. Because remember, as we age, cartilage starts to deteriorate, muscles and tendons do not stretch as well, they tend to stiffen. So be careful with your older and your younger athletes. Also, your larger athletes, you need to pay attention to certain box jump heights. So anybody that's over 220 pounds, you need to make special considerations to the heights from which they jump from or the heights to which they jump to. That is a lot of weight landing on joints. So doing very high depth jumps for, like, say, your football linemen, shot putters, power lifters, your larger athletes, make sure that is also a consideration. All right. Also pay attention to body weight. As I said, your larger athletes, you need to pay attention so they're not damaging their joints. So once you've done your needs analysis and you've gone through your important considerations, you need to pick kind of how you want to do your plyometric training. So most of us are very comfortable with lower body plyometric training. We've probably all done them before or have programmed them for somebody else. So you can take an athlete through a continuation from the easiest to the more difficult jumps. So typically we start with a jump in place. Jump roping would be a good example here, or just having athletes do line jumps. Then you can move into standing jumps. These are things like rocket jumps, squat thrusters, things like this. This is more plyometric in nature, but I'm adding dynamics. From there, you can go into multiple hops. These are things like doing 3 jumps for distance. We call them frog jumps. Maybe I am having you jump on your right leg only for a few hops at a time, then left leg only. Skips would be a good example here as well. Then you're going to go into bounding. Bounding are basic plyometric skips. So skips for height, skips for distance. Maybe we're doing extension runs. This is very common in sprinting. Maybe I have them bound over short hurdles. There's a lot of different examples here. Once they've graduated past bounding, then you can start doing box jumps. So this is where the athlete either takes a step or is static, and they're going to jump to a height. Once they are good at box jumps, then you can start adding depth jumps where they're going to step off of a height and then bound up to a next height. These are a great progression. And notice I said progression. Sometimes we want to hop people right into box jumps, and they're not ready yet. They don't know how to absorb their landing. They have improper technique. Realistically, you should start with your athletes jumping in place, see how they move, and then bring them up. Making sure that they are appropriately prepared to handle the loads required to do plyometric training appropriately. So remember, sometimes your beginners can only handle like 80 contacts. Plyometric training will beat you up because there is a lot of that eccentric loading phase, which can cause damage. It also builds you up very strongly. So plyometric training should really only be a once or twice a week thing. Moving into upper body plyometrics, we can do a lot of stuff here. Typically this is med balls, so med ball slams, med ball passes, med ball throws. I can also do catches, so having to absorb weight as it comes in. Again, med balls are great for this. And then I can do millions of push-up variations to make them plyometric in nature. So one of the most common would be something like a clapping push-up, or having to push and jump off of the ground would be a modification for that. And then you can also do core plyometrics. Typically, this is going to be forcing the body to absorb a blow and then push it back out. So one of my favorites for core is catching a med ball, rotating, and throwing it back. So side throws for med balls is a great core plyometric exercise. A final consideration with plyometrics is when you complete them, in addition to resistance training, you don't want to do plyometrics and resistance training on the same body part on the same day. So doing a heavy leg plyometrics workout and then going into squat is a really bad idea. So, however, if I want to do leg plyometrics and then turn around and do an upper body day, that would be completely fine. So make sure you are not doubling up on plyometrics, sprints, or resistance training on the same muscle group at the same time. This is going to cause abnormal fatigue, which, as we talked about earlier, we need to manage our stressors so our athletes don't get burned out. We also do not want to put them at an increased risk of injury. So, with that said, that is plyometrics in a nutshell. I look forward to talking to you guys about Chapter 19. Have a good evening. Bye.